Some riders on the MBTA might be a little more squeezed for space these days or looking for another way to get around. That's because of service cuts that took effect Sunday. These follow a sharp decrease in ridership and revenue connected with the pandemic, but also on the heels of a new surge in relief money from the federal government. That's why the Transit is Essential Coalition says the cuts go too far with too much risk of long term losses. Joining us is a member of the coalition, the Boston Program Manager at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, Julia Wallerce. Thank you very much for being with us, Julia.
Hi, thanks for having me, Chris.
Sure, I want to start with just what it feels like right now to be out riding the T. It wasn't so long ago, Governor Baker was saying it's bad public policy to have empty trains and buses, but I'm looking at these different social media feeds rather, they don't look empty.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that. They actually were never empty, and it's you could say but bad public policy to say that they ever were empty. There was always people, even if there's only a handful of people. Those are people, and they're using that service not because they're out for a joyride. They're using that service because they need it, and they're the people who need to get to the jobs throughout this pandemic, in the services that we all rely on. And just now, we are at that point where there's finally light at the end of the tunnel. We have, May 1st timeline for when we can all get a vaccine. We're looking at coming back to work, people starting to make trips again. And so, yes, those vehicles are becoming more crowded. Just as we're getting out on the roads again by all sorts of different modes, but particularly transit, the T is cutting back service. And that has resulted in some dangerous crowding and really the opposite direction that we should be going anytime, but especially in a pandemic.
I want to ask you to make a distinction here because transportation is about getting from here to there, but it's also about the rider experience. And I know there's still this residual anxiety about the pandemic. What is the experience like for someone who's riding those trains, maybe on a regular basis, and just feeling nervous about all those people?
Well, people don't want to be in a crowded space with other people in any sort of vessel, especially a bus or a train where you are constrained. And yes, I mean, people have been great about wearing their masks. Overall, anytime that I have ridden transit over the pandemic and all the reports we're getting, the behavior is good. The drivers have protection, but we can't have more people crammed into small spaces. So the experience of being crowded is alarming. And also the experience of not knowing when your next bus or train is going to come, and worse, knowing that it may not come at all because there have been 9 bus lanes gone. 20% of service across the subways has been cut. That's significant headways. That makes a big difference in somebody's daily routine, especially people who are used to the routine as it has been, rely on that service to get to work every day or to make their trips. It's not just commuting trips that people rely on this service for. It's getting to the grocery store, going to see the doctor, taking children to school more as children are starting to return. Life is beginning to pick up pace, and our transit system is falling behind.
Well, the T just got something like 850 million from the federal government. Is that enough money really for them to just keep things going the way they were?
Absolutely. If you count for the beginning of the pandemic, the T has actually received almost $2 billion in federal relief. So if we're in a place where we can't figure out how to not just restore, but maintain and even expand transit service with $2 billion, we've got a problem. And really the crux of that problem is that there's a structural deficit at the T. We don't fund transit adequately in the short or long term. We rely on fares for about a third of the budget. So when ridership fluctuates, the budget is incredibly vulnerable. So the T has been sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place of wanting to prepare for service when ridership returns. And I say when ridership returns because it's not as if there's not ridership. There are still people who have continued to ride these buses and trains since day one of the shutdown. But we know people are going to come back, and the T is worried that they won't have money in fiscal 2022, 2023, when they know there won't be another federal relief package. So they've been using that money to prepare for the future at the expense of today. And that sends a dangerous and alarming messages to riders, to employers, to developers. It's a reverberating effect across the system that transit is not reliable. And if you can afford it, you should get back in your car. And that is the wrong message at the wrong time.
Well, what about the future? There are some reasons for pessimism about ridership. People will be reluctant for a while to get on those crowded trains. And on the other hand, you also have these employers who aren't going to have as many people working out of offices as in the past. So what about that?
Yeah, well, we actually do see that, as people come back to work, it will be more flexible. It probably will still have some work from home. We'll be using office space more efficiently. I mean, we just saw, Sasaki is moving downtown, Boston. We're not going to a full work from home economy, but the argument there is that as a result, we need to shift service to be frequent throughout the day. Frequency is really key. The concern is crowding. We don't want to be packing people into buses and trains. In order to do that, well, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that those trains are running, to make sure they're running frequently, and second, to make sure that they're not stuck in traffic. The momentum you see behind you with these dedicated bus lanes have really taken off over the last couple of years across the regions. That's to ensure that buses aren't stuck in the same traffic that cars are, so that we're creating an appeal. If you choose the bus, you will get to work on time. You know how long it will take, and you know when the bus will show up. And we need to make sure we're running more of those buses, more of those trains to ease people's fears, to make people feel confidence in the system and not skepticism and not reluctance, which is what cutting service does.
Well, another response, especially to the future, is Senator Joe Boncore's Transportation New Deal. What do you like about that?
We like a lot of things about that, and that is really an omnibus package of so many of the solutions, which really get to the heart of the matter, which is that we just don't fund transit adequately. We can't continue to rely on fares for the bulk of our funding. We need to carve out other revenue sources. We need to stop subsidizing driving and making it the cheaper alternative, making it the more convenient alternative. And yes, there is a cost to this. We all need to, dig into our pockets collectively to fund the service that we all rely on, to make it better, to make sure that we meet our climate goals, our decarbonization goals. In the Transportation New Deal, yes, there is a whole robust collections of ways to generate revenue for transportation, not just today, but for tomorrow. Everything from making the gas tax keep up with inflation, raising the gas tax, charging fees on transportation, Ubers and Lyft, which the governor had vetoed in the bond bill, fees on parking, looking at road tolling. We need to carve out these sources of revenue that we're not currently putting towards our transit system. And as a result, the cost of doing nothing is killing us, and it's going to keep us back in traffic. We're going to get right back there as the congestion champions that we were just a year ago this month, 2 years in a row. Do we want to go back? Do we want that to be our legacy? We don't think so.
Because the other thing that she says is that these are short-term cuts, and I'm reading between the lines. At least I'm trying to, and I'm saying maybe they'll just reverse these in 3 or 4 months. I mean, can it be done that easily?
That is absolutely the T's intention. And I know that they very much want this to be responsive. And, when the ridership comes back, we'll bring it back. They say they want to be back at, 80%, 90% of baseline service by the fall. The problem is, once we bring the service back, will the riders be there? Will the riders have faith in the system, or will they have lost confidence and already sought out another way? People need that service today. If they have an option, they probably will take it. If you don't know that that bus is going to be there, if you see that the trains are derailing, like we just saw yesterday on the Orange Line, it doesn't give you a lot of faith in the system. So once you take it away, not only is it hard to get the service back, but if you get the service back, will the riders be there? Or will we have lost those riders to other less desirable modes, like getting back in the car for those who can afford it, for those who even have the option?
Because what we're also seeing now, especially with the suspension of a few bus routes in Boston, is that you have lines that might have low ridership, but at the same time, you have communities where people are, really depend on that service and they're not getting it anymore. Is
Mhm.
there another way to meet those needs without having a full-size bus that runs as often?
I think you're getting at the question of retention versus ridership, and not just looking at the number of people in the bus, but the ridership, how steady the ridership has been maintained, because that is an indication of just how critical that bus is. Yes, you see some buses that maybe only had a handful of people in them during the shutdown, but every day those people were on that service. And what we know from that is that's a critical service. And that the transit, that no, it should not be cut. We don't treat our roads that way. We haven't stopped maintaining roads or filling potholes just because less people were driving. Why are we doing that to transit? It's the same thing. It's a public good, and we need to treat it and fund it as such.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was Julia Wallerce with the Transit is Essential Coalition. We'll have more news in just a moment.